Ray tracing. Ray tracing is a graphics tool that makes lighting and reflections look more realistic. Here's how it works. Instead of simply adding light to objects, ray tracing lets the GPU simulate how light travels from a source, hits surfaces, and creates accurate reflections and shadows. Let's compare two images to make this clearer. Without ray tracing, reflections are often inaccurate. Even though there's a light source here, you can't see any reflection on the floor. On top of that, the reflection on the car doesn't make sense because it appears on the right side while the light is coming from the left. But when ray tracing is turned on, the tools clearly reflect the light source, and the reflection also appears on the correct side of the car. Even though it looks great, that doesn't mean you should always use ray tracing. It really shines in scenes with light sources near reflective surfaces, like glass, water, or similar objects. But if a game takes place mostly in open areas without reflective surfaces, the difference becomes very small, even with ray tracing turned on. On top of that, using ray tracing will drop your frame rate since this feature demands a lot of GPU power and video memory. This is even worse in competitive games, since without ray tracing, you can still get hundreds of frames per second. With it turned on, your frame rate will drop significantly. Path tracing. Path tracing is similar to ray tracing, but even more advanced. Ray tracing only handles effects like light sources and reflections in certain areas. Some parts of a scene aren't affected even if there's a bright neon light nearby. Path tracing, on the other hand, calculates lighting for the entire scene, which makes the overall image look even more realistic. Because of this, some scenes can look so close to real life that it becomes hard to tell what's rendered and what was actually filmed. That said, this also makes path tracing much more demanding, so your frame rate will drop significantly, even more than with ray tracing. And just like before, if a scene has balanced lighting, the difference between ray tracing and path tracing can be very small. On the other hand, in scenes with lots of light sources and reflective materials, path tracing can sometimes make reflections too intense. Ray tracing can actually look better in those cases, since it isn't flat, but it also isn't overly reflective. For these reasons, more people prefer using ray tracing over path tracing. DLSS, which stands for Deep Learning. Super sampling is a feature made by NVIDIA that helps ease the load on your GPU. It's especially useful if you often use ray tracing or play at high resolutions. For example, when you play a game at 4K resolution, the GPU has to render more than 8 million pixels every single frame, which can be an enormous amount of work. So instead of forcing that, we can use DLSS. Now the GPU only needs to render the game at 1080p, and the rest is handled by DLSS using an AI upscaling technique to reach that 4K resolution. And since the GPU only has to render the lower resolution, performance becomes much lighter as well. As a result, even if a demanding game only runs at around 30 frames per second natively, DLSS can significantly boost that frame rate and make the game feel much smoother. However, since it relies on AI reconstruction, DLSS can sometimes show small visual artifacts or minor glitches. Because of this, some people don't like using it and prefer native resolution instead. FSR stands for Fidelity, FX Super Resolution, and it's AMD's version of upscaling technology. Similar to DLSS, images are rendered at a lower resolution and then upscaled to a higher resolution to improve performance. However, in terms of image quality, FSR can sometimes look a bit less sharp and solid compared to DLSS. The good news is that while DLSS is only available on NVIDIA GPUs, FSR works on both AMD and NVIDIA graphics cards. This makes it a great alternative option, especially since DLSS can sometimes show visual issues like ghosting or blurriness, particularly after certain driver updates. Frame generation is a feature that can boost your frame rate and smooth out motion in demanding games. Normally, Your GPU renders each frame one at a time, but with frame generation turned on, the system inserts artificial frames between the real ones. Because of this, the total frame rate shown on screen becomes much higher, which makes motion look smoother. But even though it looks smoother, frame generation can also increase latency, or input lag. In practice, when we compare responsiveness between the two, in native rendering, the frame has already reached its target and moved past it. But with frame generation turned on, the frame is still traveling and hasn't reached the target yet. That's why frame generation isn't ideal for fast-paced competitive games. It works better for cinematic AAA games, where smooth visuals matter more than reaction time. On top of that, some people also prefer native rendering because it looks more solid and has better image accuracy. As you can see here, frame generation can sometimes introduce visual issues like distortion or ghosting. Dynamic resolution is a feature that helps maintain a stable frame rate in demanding scenes. Let's say we're playing at a steady 60 frames per second. Normally, when heavy visual effects show up, like explosions or large particle effects, the GPU has to work harder and the frame rate suddenly drops, then returns to normal once the scene becomes lighter again. But when dynamic resolution is turned on, the game automatically lowers the resolution during those demanding moments, which keeps the frame rate stable. Then, once the heavy effects are gone, the resolution goes back up to its original level. HDR stands for High Dynamic Range, and it's a feature that improves the brightness and color depth of a scene. Without HDR, images can look flat. But when you turn on HDR, contrast becomes stronger, and colors look richer, even the smallest details in the background. This is great, because when colors are clearly separated, it's easier to spot objects or enemies hiding in shadows or fog. Without HDR, it's hard to make out an object's shape since everything blends together. Just remember, your TV or monitor also needs to support HDR. If it doesn't, you won't see the full HDR effect on screen. Display sync is a technology that handles screen tearing. Tearing happens when the GPU outputs frames per second at a different rate than the monitor's refresh rate. When a new frame is sent before the monitor finishes displaying the previous one, parts of two different frames appear on screen at the same time. To fix this, there's a technology called vertical sync, or VSync, which forces the GPU to match the monitor's refresh rate. However, this can also increase input lag, since the GPU is being forced to keep pace with the monitor. To improve on this, NVIDIA introduced G-Sync, and AMD introduced FreeSync. Instead of forcing the GPU like VSync does, these technologies let the monitor dynamically sync its refresh rate to match the GPU's output. As a result, this handles tearing while also keeping input latency lower compared to traditional VSync. Just remember, to use G-Sync or FreeSync, you'll also need a compatible monitor that supports these features. That's why I've also tagged a few recommended monitors that are compatible in case you're interested. Anti-Aliasing is a feature that smooths out jagged edges in games. In video games, many objects can look jagged along their edges. This effect is called aliasing, and it happens because games are rendered using pixels. You might not notice these jagged edges if you're sitting a bit farther from the screen, but since most people sit closer while gaming, those edges become visible, making the game's graphics look rough around the edges. That's exactly why anti-aliasing is so useful. It makes everything look clean and smooth. Anisotropic filtering. When a scene shows a long road or a wide open space, usually only the objects close to you look sharp, while distant objects start to look blurry and undefined. This is a real problem, since a lot of games require us to view the world from this kind of angle, like racing games or massive open world games. That's where anisotropic filtering comes in. It allows the GPU to keep textures sharp, even when they're far away on screen. Texture quality textures are the images wrapped around objects, like the pattern on a wall or the fabric of a character's clothing. Just to be clear, Texture quality is different from resolution. Resolution changes the number of pixels, like 1080p or 4K, and affects the clarity of the entire image. Texture quality, on the other hand, only changes the level of detail on the surfaces of objects, not the image as a whole. When it comes to texture detail, most low-quality textures show no pattern at all, like on a wall. At medium quality, some patterns start to appear, even if they still look a bit soft. At high texture quality, the detail becomes clearly visible and much more realistic. But if you push it up to ultra, the difference compared to high is very small. That's why most people, myself included, prefer high over ultra, especially since you barely notice the difference in detail, and it puts less strain on the GPU. NVENC is a hardware video encoder built into NVIDIA graphics cards, and it's incredibly useful for streaming and recording. Normally, when you're streaming or recording, your CPU handles the encoding. But that's not ideal, since encoding is a demanding task that can lower your frame rate. With NVENC, encoding is instead handled by a dedicated chip inside the GPU. As a result, CPU usage stays low and frame rate drops are kept to a minimum. Anyway, I've also made some other great videos, so don't forget to check those out afterward, alright?